Welcome to Justice7x7, an informational podcast brought to you by the San Francisco's District Attorney's Victim Services Division. In this podcast, we will explore issues in our community with an emphasis on a trauma-informed approach.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Justice7x7. My name is Michael Sly, and I work in the Victim Services Division at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. We'll be starting this podcast by interviewing the leaders of our division and office, District Attorney George Gascon and Chief of Victim Services, Dr. Gina Castro-Rodriguez. We're here with San Francisco District Attorney George Gascon. Mr. Gascon came to San Francisco as the police chief in 2009, and in 2011 he was appointed by Mayor Gavin Newsom to serve as the district attorney. In 2012, he was elected by the people. He was a driving force in the passage of Proposition 47 in 2014, which reduced many nonviolent crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. In January of this year, he made the decision to retroactively apply Proposition 64 to all marijuana cases since 1975. Thanks for coming in today, Mr. Gascon.
Thank you for having me.
What is your vision for this office as the district attorney?
There are many things that I would call my vision for the office, but the first and foremost thing is that we create a place where we make a difference in the community that we serve, and we do so by creating an environment where our community is safer, but we do so in a way also that is thoughtful, that respects people, that is respectful of differences, that it doesn't apply too much to the criminal justice system when that doesn't need to occur, that we're able to reduce incarceration, that we're humanistic about the work that we do. Also, I want to create a place where the people that work here are passionate about the work and they come every day looking forward to what we do. I'm very committed to criminal justice reform. That was really the driver for me to come here and switch from policing into prosecution. I did so because I believe that prosecutors have this incredible ability to make a difference in the way that the laws are applied. And to a great extent, I think that whether you talk about the war on drugs or you talk about or mass incarceration, whatever area you want to touch upon involving the criminal justice system, prosecutors play a central role in how things go. Also, prosecutors have a tremendous amount of credibility when it comes to legislating new laws or initiatives or implementing different policies, whether it's at the local, at the state, or even at the national level. So it's a very influential, very powerful position. And I believe that if you are committed to reform, it's a place where you can make a tremendous amount of difference.
Great, thank you. Since you started in 2011, what are some reforms or innovations that your office has implemented?
So we've done quite a few. In terms maybe looking first of all sort of externally, very quickly I became involved in the reform of 3 strikes. That became Proposition 36, which was passed by the voters in 2012. And basically what it did is took California's 3-strike law and made it so that the last strike would have to be a violent felony as opposed to some low-level property-related felony. We had several thousand people in the state at the time that were doing 25-year to life, and their 3rd strike could have been as little as, quite frankly, walking into a grocery store and shoplifting, because under California law at the time, if you went to a store without any means to purchase the items that you then took, it showed that you had the intent to steal, which became a second-degree burglary. It was a felony, and if you already had 2 prior strikes, that particular event could lead you into going to prison for 25 years to life. I personally thought that was obscene, and it served no real justice or did not enhance public safety. So I was asked by a group from the Stanford Law School that were basically putting together the proposition if I would be one of those spokespersons, and I was. And that passed. It kind of altered the whole dynamics around 3 strikes. And it's actually one of the most successful criminal justice reforms in terms of the low recidivism rate that we know now 6 years into this. And there were several thousand people that were released under Prop 36. The recidivism rate is extremely low. is less than 10%, which is really incredible. That kind of put me in a place where I recognized that maybe the path to some of the criminal justice reform perhaps was taking it directly to the voters. In the middle of that, too, we were going through a tremendous epidemic of phone theft, mobile phones, primarily iPhones at the time here in our community, but it was happening international, it was happening in all the major urban centers in the country. And I started to look at this, and it really occurred to me that really, if we could remove the value or reduce the value of the phone significantly, then they would be less likely to be stolen. And we started working with the industry, trying to get them to create what eventually we call a kill switch, which is basically the ability to, if your phone was stolen, that you could just simply shut the phone down remotely and the phone would not be useful to anyone else, so you could only use it for parts. That was a tremendous battle that I was not expecting. The industry fought really hard. I eventually partnered with the Attorney General of the state of New York at the time, and we took on the industry. We had the support of law enforcement. We had the support, actually, of mayors from around the world, including the mayor from London became one of our partners. And eventually we were able to pass state law here that was supported by then Senator Leno, that basically forced the industry to create the mechanism so you would be able to deactivate your phone remotely. And since then, the robberies of cell phones dropped tremendously, not only here in the city, but around the world. And a lot of that was really, we noticed that it was just really motivated by profit by the industry. They were making a lot of money and reselling more phones and more phones. Then overlaying with that, we tried to get state legislation passed to reform drug policy in this state so that if you're possessing drugs for personal use, that would be a misdemeanor, not a felony. And the certain low-level theft offenses, the threshold for a felony will be raised. The threshold for the felony at the time had been implemented over 2 decades ago, and it was $450. And we thought that just a pure application of inflation would say that it should be a lot more than that. So that became Prop 47. We could not get it passed through the legislature, so again we went to the voters in 2014, and that passed, and that actually resulted in the biggest reduction of incarceration in the state in our history. There was realignment AB 109 that the governor passed before, but actually Prop 47 resulted even in larger reductions, and it gave, quite frankly, relief to communities that were heavily impacted by the war on drugs. We've also engaged in trying to bring more restorative justice to our work. We've done it through Young Adult Court, which is basically a court where we have serious offenders between the ages of 18 and 25, that we work collaboratively with the defense, the courts, and other service providers, and we try to identify ways to keep the person from reoffending at the same time that we're trying to reduce the likelihood that they will be reincarcerated or incarcerated. We also have a similar program, although a little more robust, that we do for under 18 that we call Make It Right, which is a fully restorative justice model. It's what is called a community conferencing model. It started in New Zealand, where you basically bring all the parties together and you talk about the harm and how to reduce the harm. I started neighborhood courts, which is a non-judicial process, and that actually started right as soon as I became a DA. That we had a thing here before that was called community courts that was very did not have the reach that I wanted, so we created neighborhood courts. The victim services world, Gina has taken it to a whole new level, but even before Gina came here, we started having advocates going out into the street in the community. We created the first, and I believe still maybe the only, sentencing planners, that they're basically sort of social workers, if you will, that work with our prosecutors to try to determine what would be the best way about interrupting a cycle of violence or recidivism for individuals that we deal with, and often come up with structured plans that try to avoid incarceration. We've done a lot of stuff around sexual assaults on campus. That Gina has been very heavily involved in that. We've done work around the schools, trying to reduce absenteeism in the schools. We actually started 2013, I believe, we started taking funding from the office to fund counselors that would work with young people that were truants and bringing them back to school if they were not in school by 8:30, and then eventually we added a second school, and now that is being funded by the city, but initially we funded it out of our general fund, and that's been kind of a half success, half failure, because my hope was that by now we would be doing it citywide. It's still not citywide, it's only 2 schools that were doing it. I've engaged very actively around the country and the issue of dealing with police reform and police use of force, and that's it's an ongoing work, both in partnership with the police and communities, but other stakeholders, in trying to raise the awareness level around this work, and then trying to figure out ways to reduce the use of deadly force in our country. Internally, we've done a variety of things. We started, when I came to the office, we really had no way of cataloging our work or knowing the quantity of our work or who was doing what. So we started a process that we call DA Stat, which basically started to collect information about our performance, our different units, the workload, and really started opening up visibility around our work so that we knew where to apply resources. I believe the first in the nation that has done that as a district attorney. Now it's a very mature process that has been taken to levels that are even greater than anything that I anticipated. We started our crime strategies unit where we're bringing analysts to start doing work in trying to connect the dots for crimes rather than looking at a single crime or a single occurrence, how it's often presented to us for prosecution decisions. We now look, especially when we're dealing with human trafficking or other crimes of violence or property, we try to connect the dots where we can and get enough analytical support so that when we put our cases together, we have stronger cases. And we are the only 2 major counties that do this work, was Manhattan and New York City and us, to the level. But I believe that now even Manhattan will say that we're doing some things that even they're not doing. And that's all I can think of. I'm sure there are other things that I'm forgetting.
Right. Well, what are some reforms that you're currently working on? Is there anything the public can expect to see as a result?
There are 2 big things that we're working on right now. One is bail reform, and I forgot to say this actually, but I have been against money bail for a very long time, and when I first came to the office, we started working with the Arnold Foundation, trying to create a tool that would work in San Francisco, that you can assess the risk level that a person presents and determine whether they will be released or not based on that tool, as opposed to whether they can afford bail or not. We finally got the tool implemented in 2014, and it has resulted in significant reductions in pretrial detention. But in the middle of that, we've also been working at the state level trying to eliminate money bail, and now we're now in litigation around this area, and we're trying to walk a very fine line. We believe that pretrial detention may be appropriate when people are involved in violent crimes, but we believe that should be very limited. And then for other folks, they should be released into the community, and depending on their likelihood that they would offend or not, or that they will show up or not, we can create safeguards. But my main contention is that whether you are released or not should be not based on your ability to put a money bail. It should be based on whether you're dangerous or not. We know some cases where you have extremely wealthy people that are very dangerous and being able to bail out. And we know sometimes there are poor people that are not necessarily dangerous, they can't. So we're trying to reduce those inequities. The other thing, too, is that we've looked very hard at the impact of the criminal justice system in the minority groups, especially African Americans and Latinos, and we're trying to modify a lot of our work with a clear understanding of what biases do to our work, whether it's implicit or explicit. And then we're working with some partners in policing, but mostly with the community and legislators around how to reduce the use of deadly force by police and do so in a way that is safe for the officers, but it's also safe for our community.
Great. Thank you. What are some of the challenges that your office faces in serving such a unique city?
Well, there are many, and I like to think of them as opportunities sometimes as well, right? This is a very expensive city to operate in, so sometimes we attract extremely talented people, but then they can't afford to live in the city, so they have to travel very far to come to work. So trying to keep talented people that want to be here, but they cannot afford to live in the city is always a challenge. So we try to work things around, like allowing people to work from home when they don't have to be in court, providing other mechanisms for them to accomplish their work without having to be present here 100% of the time. The other part is that we know that there are areas of the work that need even more resources. For instance, human trafficking is one. It worries me a great deal because San Francisco is probably one of the major hubs of human trafficking in this country, and yet we have absolutely no staffing to do the work. So when we do the work and we do it right, we know that we can get great results, but it's very intense. It requires a lot of time. But this work requires an intensive investigation. This is work where the San Francisco Police Department started and has done incredible work here. They identify what initially looked like possibly just a simple case of prostitution, and between them and our crime strategies unit, they were able to build up this incredible case, and then we brought other partners on board. So work in this area is also complex, and it requires a lot of resources. The other thing I forgot to talk about is our consumer work. We do a lot of work around consumer. We're very active in the environmental area as well. We actually do cases for people that are polluting our environment. Interestingly enough, we do also work around protection of endangered species. We have prosecuted businesses that are selling animal skins of animals that are currently on the protected or endangered species. So it's a very interesting and very dynamic practice that we have. And the problem is that we often don't have the funding to do it right. So getting the right level of funding for the work is a big challenge for us.
Thank you. What purpose does this podcast serve, and what would you like for the public to learn from this?
I'm hoping that it does several things. The really interesting things that are going on in this office, obviously Dr. Castro and many other units here, and what we're hoping is that, we get more and more of this out there for people to have an opportunity to become acquainted with our work. And, ultimately, I would love to have people that becomes more interactive. People are actually able to work with the office, that they approach us, that they raise concerns that they have, whether it's about our practice or other things that they believe that we should be doing or not doing. So I'm hoping that this is that becomes more than simply a one-way medium of communication, but it actually allows people to start engaging us more.
Great. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're here with Dr. Gina Castro Rodriguez to discuss the San Francisco District Attorney's Victim Services Division. Thank you for joining us. Tell us about yourself and your position.
Thank you, Michael. I'm the Chief of Victim Services for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, and the division consists of multiple units inside of it. We have the Advocacy Unit, which is a unit that is assigned to work with victims of violent crime in San Francisco. Last year, that was 8,500 victims of violent crime. Those advocates are paired with victims. The advocate provides information about the criminal justice system, about their status as a victim, their rights as a victim, helps them assess what are their needs, what are the resources we can connect them to and help them access, and then how do we support them through the system in whatever part of the system they're utilizing, whether that's reporting a crime, whether that's a charged crime, whether it's going to be a case that goes to trial, that we are their link to this system throughout that process. The second piece is the California Crimes Compensation Program, and we are a jurisdiction that does the claims processing and payments for that here in San Francisco, for both San Francisco and Marin County, and we work closely with the advocates in that role to help victims of crime access resources, financial resources that they're eligible for as a victim of crime. So that includes mental health, dental, relocation, funeral and burial, safety issues for their home, things to help them recover, like crime scene cleanup. All of those resources are available to them as a victim of crime in California. Those funds are collected through fines and fees. They're not part of the general fund for the state of California, and we can help them access those as we help them recover. We also have a restitution unit, and restitution is the other fees that we can help collect from the perpetrators if a case is charged and sentenced. We can help them access monies that they lost as a victim of crime from their perpetrator, things like damage to a car or items that were lost or things that we can't pay for in victims' crime compensation. We can help them through the restitution process recover some of those dollars and resources. And then the last unit is a new unit, the Mass Casualty Crime Unit. And that's really in response to the growing number of active shooter, domestic terrorism, and international terrorisms across the United States. And the role of our office is to support victims in those incidences so that we can help them quickly recover and restore their pre-event functioning. So help them recover from whatever that trauma or event was and go back to the way their life was before that event so that this doesn't become a definition of how they move forward, and we reduce the impact of the trauma on them.
Great, thank you. How has the Victim Services Division grown in recent years?
So we've made a lot of changes over the last 4 to 5 years. We've really taken input from the community, from our partners, from the victims and witnesses that we serve, and tried to be more responsive to the changing dynamic needs of those victims and survivors, and thought a lot about how our services can be prevention, intervention, and after an event. And how do we create a continuum of services that help people recover and rebuild their lives all along that spectrum. So a few of the things we've done, we've taken all of our advocates and claim staff and trained them in working in specialized teams based on the crime units, just like our prosecutors are. So whereas a few years ago, we would have an advocate that could have a homicide case, a sexual assault case, and maybe a general felonies case, we've instead divided the advocates into units where they get some specialized training, specialized supervision, specialized support to work with different kinds of victims so that they get really good at working with the victim and the kinds of things that that victim presents with. So an example is we have an elder abuse team. An elder is anyone over 65 or a dependent adult, and the kinds of crimes that happen to elders, the kinds of needs that elders have following a crime, the kinds of resources they need as we support them through the criminal justice system are very different than they are for a 20-year-old young person here for college in San Francisco. And so it's much more responsive and much more effective when we have a team that is specifically trained, supervised, and connected to the resources that help the specific kind of victims that we're working with. So that team has advanced training in working with people that might have different cognitive abilities, different physical abilities, different linguistic abilities. They might be experiencing the crime in a more relational way, that they may be the victim of a crime because of people that are supposed to take care of and love them, differently than someone who's a victim of a crime by a stranger. We also connect better with the resources for that group. So we work very closely with Adult Protective Services or the Elder Forensic Center, the Ombudsman, different systems that they might interact with so that we have those relationships and we can support them in accessing resources. So dividing by crime type and really specializing has been a big step forward for our agency.
And are there any other new innovations or programs within your division that you'd like to speak about?
Yeah, there's a couple of other big things that we've done. We really got a message from the community that criminal justice system and law enforcement are tough systems for them to interact with, and that there are people that don't come forward to access services and get assistance in recovering because they don't want to engage with this system and be further traumatized. And so from that, we developed our community training, our community advocacy program, and that allows our advocates to be out in the community, building proactive relationships with the community members, with the community service providers, with the systems that are out there in the community, so that we build trust and relationship, and that people will access us and get resources from us when they normally wouldn't. And so We have two people that are out in Bayview, Viz Valley, and the second person is in the Mission, in the Outer Mission, and really making connections in those communities so that we can be more proactive about people who are victims of crime, but for multiple reasons cannot come forward and get assistance. And we're trying to interrupt the cycle of violence so that if we can do early intervention and provide support and treatment, that these cases don't have to end up in multiple victimizations or cross over from being victims to being perpetrators, or just not receive the kind of services and resources that they need to recover and then fail to thrive and restore following an event like being a victim of crime. So we've looked at the neighborhoods that experience the most violence, the most crime, and have the least amount of engagement with our office, and we've targeted them specifically to try to build relationship and build support in those communities to help them in these kinds of issues.
What are some unique challenges that you face while serving victims in San Francisco, and what are some strategies you use to overcome these challenges?
It's a great question. There's a lot of unique things about San Francisco. On any given day, we have 1.5 million people in the city. Only about 800,000 people live here, but we've got people coming in for the day to work, coming in because they're here on vacation, they're here because they're at school or doing business. And so we have a really vibrant community that is packed with people in a very small space. And so lots of things can happen from that scenario. A couple of things that we're dealing with recently are the impact of immigration. So the national messaging, the policies, even the fears that are coming about immigration, about people being deported, about not accessing services, about sanctuary cities, that all affects the people in the community here. And we have a lot of immigrants in San Francisco from countries all over the world who come here. And the way that it affects victims of crime is that when they don't feel safe coming forward and being out in the light, saying who they are or saying where they live or saying what's happened to them, then bad things that are happening to them go undercover and they don't get help for them. So the perpetrator continues to hurt people and the victim continues to be victimized. And, the areas that we're really concerned about are domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault. And those are the first victims that will isolate when they're afraid of the external factors of the people around them and they're afraid to access services. And they will be not only significantly harmed by the event that happens to them, but by the ongoing untreated trauma that happens when they can't come forward to receive resources. So, we have to spend a lot of time being very thoughtful about how we make the system safer for people who have very real fears for engaging with us. And we have to look through the lens of how do we make these things more trauma-informed. So in immigration, one thing that we've done is we have a escort policy where if people, they don't have to tell us about their immigration status. It doesn't matter for them to receive services. We don't ask. We don't document anything about their immigration status. But if they have any concerns about engaging with the criminal justice system and fear of ICE or any other law enforcement agency, we will escort them in and out of the building. And our staff are trained to access the Rapid Response Network, which is a network of legal service providers who can provide legal support around immigration should any of those survivors need resources or connection to those supports. And that's 24 hours a day. So we can make sure that they get the advice and the resources that they need at any time, and they don't have to disclose that information to us. We now give U and T visa, which are for people who are either immigrants and have been a victim of crime or are immigrants and have been trafficked or exploited. It gives them an opportunity to apply for a visa that allows them to stay in the country while they are going through the criminal justice system if they've been a victim of crime. And we used to only give that information once we knew that someone had an immigration issue. We now give that to every single victim of crime so that people don't have to ask. They don't have to disclose anything. They don't have to disclose that they are an undocumented immigrant. Instead, everyone gets that information. So that helps cut down on having to come forward and acknowledge that.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the term trauma-informed. What does that mean?
So being trauma-informed means that you understand that people who experience trauma have a pervasive effect of that trauma, that the trauma affects them in many ways. What's really important here is that you have to know the population that you work with. In the Victim Services Division, we know that every single person that walks into our door has been the victim of a crime and has experienced trauma. No one comes here because it's just a nice place to be or they had nothing to do today. They're here because something terrible has happened to them, maybe even the worst day of their life. So everything that we do, from the way our facility looks, to the questions that we ask, to how we engage with people, how we serve them, how we assess them, has to be done through that lens. So trauma-informed is understanding what trauma is and having your staff trained in knowing what trauma is and what it does to people and how it affects them. It's looking at all of your services and making sure that your services are specifically for people who've experienced trauma, and that those services don't re-trigger or re-traumatize people. Instead, they're focused on the recovery and giving voice and choice to the victims and survivors that we work with. It's looking at your policies and procedures and making sure that why we do things and how we do things take into account the kinds of people that we serve and what is in their best interests at all times, and that we don't do things that we don't need to do, that we don't collect information that we don't have to collect, we don't create processes that we don't need to create, that we make things as easy and accessible and as responsive to the victims that we serve as we possibly can. And then the last thing is that we take care of our victims and our staff equally. That we are here because we care about human beings and what happens to them. And we need to take that same care with our staff, that we think about what kind of work we're asking them to do, and that we look at everything that we do to engage with them, and from hiring to, maintaining them here in the office, to providing them the tools and the resources that they need, to evaluating their jobs, that we're doing that in a way that allows them to do really hard work, that where they're experiencing trauma, where they're hearing horrible stories, where they're watching system failures, where they're sometimes seeing justice and sometimes not seeing justice, and that they are a living person engaging in that, and that it's our responsibility to care for them in that work. And if you do those four things, you are really trauma-informed. But, many agencies, unfortunately, will take a piece of that, which is a start, but it's work. It's long-term work to implement those four strategies. And it doesn't happen overnight, and we are going on the fourth year of implementing it. We have a lot of work to do still, but it has to be an ongoing, continual process. If you're committed to the idea that people who experience trauma need resources and supports, and that you need to take care of the people who provide those services.
What are some of the most vulnerable victims and survivors that your office serves?
So many of our victims are vulnerable, but we've really tried to focus on some of the populations that seem to experience the most victimization and have a longer path to recovery, and think about how we could better serve them and support them, and also help them in their own choice and their own opportunities, their own options for recovery. That we have populations of victims and survivors who have been violated and their power and control has been taken away, and that part of our services to them have to be to reinstitute that power and control and give them lots and lots of options in how they create their own path to recovery. And so 3 of those groups that we are working with very closely and trying to adapt and engage our services in a really responsive way are for human trafficking victims, sexual assault survivors, and domestic violence survivors. In human trafficking, we have a dedicated human trafficking advocate, one currently that focuses on child sex and adult sex trafficking. And those are 2 populations of people who not only are experiencing the trauma of the current criminal event, but likely have a history of other traumatic events that they've experienced that have made them vulnerable to exploitation. And so we have these complicated cases of people who have experienced a lot of physical and emotional trauma, and that their engagement with the criminal justice system could also be more triggering and traumatic. And so we have to work really hard to help provide a lot of options and resources that are about their identifying them as a victim and survivor and providing them resources and supports to recover outside of the criminal justice system. and making sure that when they do engage with the criminal justice system, that we make it as responsive and healthy as we possibly can for them by providing a lot of information, by being there to support them all the way through the process, by helping protect them when they need protecting, by making sure that their voice is heard when they have an opportunity to have their voice heard. Another group are sexual assault survivors. Of 1,000 cases of sexual assault, only 7 nationally will be charged or prosecuted. So a majority of people who experience sexual assault, 1, never report the sexual assault, and 2, never receive treatment or support for being a survivor of sexual assault. And knowing that information forces us to really look at how do we help define healing and recovery and justice for a group of people that may not find it in the traditional criminal justice system. And the way that we have to do that is to be really good at listening to a survivor and hearing what do they need, what do they want, what would help, and then helping them connect to whatever those resources are and recover in whatever recovery means for them. It's one of the areas where we can't have a predetermined plan. We have to really think about what is going on for this person in their individual experience and what will help make them better. And then the last one is an area that we've done a lot of work in over the last several years, which is domestic violence. This office has a dedicated unit for domestic violence that includes prosecutors and victim advocates and investigators. And the reason we do that is that, again, these are very complicated cases where the trauma is in a relationship and that there are lots of reasons why the trauma persists and why survivors do or don't or are not able to protect themselves or remove themselves from the situation. And it is our job to understand all of those factors that lead to and maintain domestic violence so that we can support a survivor to be safer and to make their own choice in how they want to go down their own path of healing, how they recover. For them, for their children, for their family, for their community. So it's really important that we have a lot of options for survivors of domestic violence that deal with their safety, that deal with their physical health, that deal with their mental health, and that deal with the other factors that could be maintaining their vulnerability in a relationship, like jobs or housing or education. All of those factors contribute to their vulnerability. And so our course of action with them might be really complicated and complex, but it's because their facilitation in being a victim of crime is really complicated and complex. And we want to give them as many options and resources as we possibly can so they can make decisions about the path that they want their life to take and the things that they can do to reduce harm in their life and reduce risk.
Why did you decide to do a podcast? What would you like our listeners to learn from this project?
We're always looking for ways to inform the community about what we do and engage them so that we can learn from them and we can be more responsive to what they need. And a podcast is a great way for us to spend some time talking about why we do what we do, how we do what we do, how people can access our resources and services, and provides an opportunity for people to come back to us and give us some thoughts about what we're doing and what we could be doing better and where we're needed and, what we might be missing. So I'm really excited about this opportunity for people to get to know us better. I was in the social services field for a long time. I had very little understanding of victim services and what they did. I didn't feel like the community was very connected with the work, and we should absolutely be connected because we are a resource and we're a support and we have great connection with this system and information that we can provide. We can play a big role in recovery. And in order to do that, though, people need to understand what it is we do, what do we have capacity to do, and how we do that so that they build trust with us and they see us as a part of their recovery, not just as a part of the criminal justice system.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of Justice7x7. I'd like to thank our guests, District Attorney George Gascon and Dr. Gina Castro-Rodriguez.
Thank you for listening to Justice 7x7. A special thank you to all of our guests on today's episode. For more information about this podcast or victim services, please email us at victimservices@sfgov.org or check us out on Instagram at Justice7x7.